Halloween 2015 was a night I'll never forget. Not because of any spooky costumes or haunted houses, but because of something much more unsettling. I was walking home from a Halloween party in the early hours of the morning. It wasn't too far, just a 20-minute walk, and I figured it'd be a good way to clear my head after a night of drinking and celebrating with friends. The streets were mostly empty at that point, with only a few stragglers still out in costume, wandering back from bars or parties. I wasn't worried about being out alone. It was a safe neighborhood, and I had walked this route dozens of times before without incident. About halfway home, I noticed a car driving slowly behind me. It wasn't a typical car, though. It was a police cruiser. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming the officer was just making their rounds, maybe keeping an eye on the late-night Halloween crowd. But then the car pulled up beside me, and the window rolled down. The officer inside asked if I needed a ride home. I was a bit surprised, but I figured maybe they were just being helpful, considering it was late, and I was walking alone. I hesitated for a moment, but the offer seemed innocent enough. It was an officer, after all. I thanked them and got into the car, but almost immediately something felt off. The interior of the car wasn't what I expected. It was bare, not like the police cruisers I'd seen before. There was no radio, no laptop mount, just an empty dashboard. The officer wasn't wearing a proper uniform either. He had on a dark jacket with no badge, and when I glanced at his belt, I noticed there wasn't a gun or any of the other typical equipment officers carry. My heart started to race as I realized this might not be a real officer. But we were already driving, and the streets were getting emptier as we headed away from the more populated areas. I asked where we were going, and he just gave me a smile, one that didn't reach his eyes, and told me not to worry about it. Panic set in. I knew I had to get out of that car. As we approached a red light, I made a split-second decision. I grabbed the door handle, pushed it open, and jumped out of the car, hitting the pavement hard. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain in my knees, and ran toward the nearest house with lights on. I didn't look back until I was pounding on the door, begging for help. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, the car was gone. It had sped off into the night, leaving me alone in the middle of the street. The people in the house called the police, and when real officers arrived, I told them everything. They searched the area but found nothing, no sign of the car or the man who had posed as an officer. For weeks, I was on edge, terrified that the man might find me again, that I hadn't gotten away as cleanly as I thought. But he never showed up again, and as far as I know, the police never caught him. Whoever he was, he had a plan that night, and I had narrowly escaped being a part of it. Now, whenever I see a police car driving slowly behind me, I can't help but feel a knot of anxiety in my chest. You never know who's behind the wheel or what their intentions might be, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones you need to fear the most. It was Halloween night in 2019, and my friends Ben, Sarah, and I decided to visit a corn maze just outside of town. We had been to the same place the year before, and it had always been a fun, relaxed environment. This wasn't one of those haunted attractions with actors dressed as monsters jumping out to scare you. It was just a simple maze where people came with their families, holding flashlights, laughing, and enjoying the crisp autumn air. The idea of being lost in a maze under the stars was thrilling, but nothing about it was supposed to be truly scary. We arrived around 9 p.m., and the crowd had thinned out a bit by then. Fewer people meant fewer distractions, and we thought we'd have a better chance of getting lost and enjoying the challenge of finding our way out. The night air was still and quiet, with only the occasional burst of laughter from another group making its way through the maze. As we made our way deeper into the maze, everything seemed normal at first. We were laughing, joking around, and making wrong turns just for the fun of it. But halfway through, I noticed a man standing at a distance, just outside the path we were on. He wasn't part of a group, and he wasn't moving. His face was obscured by an old, dirty coat, and he wore a baseball cap pulled low over his face. I assumed he was just another person wandering the maze, maybe taking a break or waiting for someone. But something about the way he stood there, motionless, unnerved me. As we walked past him, he didn't move. He didn't even look in our direction. I shook it off, thinking it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. A couple of turns later, I saw him again, this time a little closer. He was still standing there, completely still, and it felt like he was watching us, though I couldn't see his eyes under the cap. I felt a knot form in my stomach, but we kept moving, not wanting to overreact. Every few turns, we would see him again. He was never running or making any effort to catch up with us, but it was like he knew where we were going and would just appear in our line of sight. The first couple of times I thought it was just a coincidence, but after the third or fourth time, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't like he was lost. He was following us, keeping his distance but always within sight. We decided to pick up the pace and take a few random turns to shake him off. It worked for a little while, and we stopped seeing him. Just as we were starting to feel relieved, we hit a dead end. We turned around to retrace our steps, and there he was, standing at the entrance to the path we had just taken. He was blocking our only way out. My stomach dropped, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The man stood there completely still, staring at us. He slowly reached into his coat, and that's when I saw the glint of metal in the faint moonlight. He was holding a large hunting knife. It wasn't a prop, and it wasn't part of some Halloween prank. The knife was real, and the way he held it made my blood run cold. Without hesitating, we turned and ran, taking random turns, desperate to put as much distance between us and him as possible. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could hear Ben and Sarah gasping for breath behind me. Every turn felt like it took us deeper into the maze, further from safety. Eventually, we heard the sound of voices in the distance and followed it, finally bursting out of the maze and into the small crowd gathered near the entrance. We immediately told the staff what had happened, but by the time they went back into the maze with a few workers, the man was gone. They searched the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of him. No one matching his description had entered the maze, and no one had reported seeing anything unusual. The fact that he vanished without a trace still haunts me. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm certain he wasn't there for fun. It's a memory that sticks with me every Halloween, and I've never gone back to that maze since. It was Halloween night in 2016, and my wife and I had decided to spend the evening at home. We lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where Halloween was typically a big event. The streets would be filled with kids in costumes, and the porch lights of every house would flicker in the night as families handed out candy. By 9 p.m., the neighborhood began to settle into a calm, quiet lull. Just as we were ready to call it a night, there was a knock at the door. I figured it was just some older kids looking to squeeze in a last-minute trick-or-treat, so I got up to answer the door. When I opened the door, there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the street was eerily quiet. The cool autumn breeze swept through the yard, but there wasn't a single person in sight. I stepped out onto the porch to take a quick look around, thinking maybe someone had knocked and run off as a prank. But as I glanced down the street, I noticed a man standing under the streetlight a few houses down. He wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my direction. He wasn't wearing a costume, just a plain hoodie pulled low over his face. I couldn't make out any details, but something about his posture made me feel uneasy. I quickly went back inside, locked the door, and turned off the porch light. A few minutes later, there was another knock. This time it was quieter, more deliberate. I felt a growing sense of dread, like something was very wrong. I peered through the peephole, expecting to see more kids or maybe the man I'd seen earlier, but there was no one there. My heart started to race and I began to wonder if it had all been in my head. Then I heard the soft tapping of footsteps outside, moving from the front door to the side of the house. My pulse quickened, and I moved quietly to the window, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever it was. The man was now standing by the side window, staring directly into the house. His face was still obscured by the hood, but the way he stood there, completely still, made my blood run cold. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I grabbed my phone and called the police, explaining the situation as calmly as I could. It felt like hours before they arrived, though it was probably only minutes. When the officers searched the area, the man was gone. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been in the yard. The next morning, I found muddy footprints leading from the front porch around the side of the house. stopping just beneath our bedroom window. Whoever the man was, he had been watching us, waiting for the right moment. The police never found him, and nothing ever came of the incident, but I still get an uneasy feeling every time I hear a knock at the door after dark. Halloween night, 2017. It was one of those cool autumn evenings where the sky was just beginning to cloud over. The air was crisp, and there was an energy to the night that made you feel like something could happen. My friends and I had been invited to a big Halloween party at a friend's house in a neighborhood that was known for going all out with decorations and festivities. Everyone was there. Costumes ranging from classic ghosts and vampires to elaborate, detailed characters from movies. The atmosphere was perfect. Among the crowd of costumed partygoers, there was one man who stood out. He was dressed in a simple but unsettling costume, a plain, old-fashioned suit, and a white plastic mask that covered his entire face. It wasn't the kind of mask that screamed Halloween fun, but rather one that seemed intentionally blank, devoid of any emotion. He moved slowly through the house, not talking to anyone, not drinking, just there. At first we thought nothing of it. After all, it was Halloween and people got creative with their costumes. But as the night went on, people started to notice that no one seemed to know who this man was. We assumed he was someone's guest, but every time someone approached him to strike up a conversation, he would simply turn and walk away. His silence was eerie, and the way he drifted from room to room without saying a word started to make people uncomfortable. As the party wore on, the energy in the room began to shift. The usual laughter and conversation began to die down, and more people were whispering about the strange man in the mask. At one point, I caught sight of him standing in the corner of the living room, staring directly at me through the eye holes of the mask. He wasn't moving, just standing there, completely still, as if waiting for something. I looked away for a moment, and when I looked back, he was gone. The night continued, but the presence of the masked man lingered in the back of everyone's mind. People started to leave early, their excuses ranging from tiredness to having early plans the next day. As the crowd thinned out, it became harder to ignore the fact that the masked man hadn't left. He was still there, still silently watching. Later in the evening, I went to the kitchen to get some water. As I stood by the sink, I saw him again, standing in the backyard, just beyond the sliding glass door. The backyard was dimly lit by a few strands of fairy lights, casting long shadows across the grass. He was standing perfectly still, staring at the house. His mask, expressionless and white, looked even more unsettling in the low light. I called out to my friends in the next room, but by the time they came to see what I was talking about, the man was gone again. It was as if he had vanished into the shadows. We searched the backyard, thinking maybe he was just hiding or trying to pull some kind of prank, but there was no sign of him. As the night wound down and the last few guests left, the masked man was nowhere to be found. We never saw him leave, but we never saw him again either. In the days that followed, we all tried to figure out who he was, but no one had invited him. He wasn't a friend of a friend, and no one recognized his description. It was as if he had simply appeared at the party, spent the night silently observing, and then disappeared without a trace. To this day, none of us know who he was or what his intentions were, but the image of that blank white mask staring at me from the shadows of the backyard is something I'll never forget. A few years ago, on Halloween night, I hosted a small party at my apartment. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a handful of friends, some drinks, and a laid-back atmosphere. My place wasn't very big, so I kept the guest list short, making sure to only invite people I knew. The evening started out perfectly fine. We were all hanging out in the living room, talking, laughing, and occasionally answering the door for trick-or-treaters. At one point, I noticed someone standing near the door, dressed in a long black cloak with a hood that obscured their face. I assumed it was just another guest who had arrived late, though I didn't recognize the costume. No big deal. People sometimes brought friends without telling me. Throughout the night, I kept noticing this person. They never said a word, never joined any conversations, and seemed to linger in the corners of the room, always keeping a distance. The cloak was long and heavy, and it covered their body completely, almost like a monk's robe. Something about the silence and the way they positioned themselves made me uneasy. It was strange, but not wanting to seem paranoid, I brushed it off as someone playing a role, fully immersed in their Halloween character. At one point, though, I realized I hadn't seen this person eat, drink, or even take off their hood. They just stood there, blending into the background. As the night went on and more people started to leave, I asked a couple of my friends who the cloaked person was. None of them had any idea. They assumed the same thing I had, that the figure was a guest who had come with someone else. That's when things started to feel off. I went around asking others if they knew who the cloaked person was, but no one had invited them, and no one knew their name. The party continued winding down, and eventually, it was just me and a few close friends left. That's when I noticed the cloaked figure was still there, standing near the window, watching the last few guests say their goodbyes. It struck me as odd because the rest of the party had dispersed, and this person hadn't left with anyone. I went over to confront them, thinking maybe it was a prank. But by the time I reached the spot near the window, the cloaked figure was gone. There was no sign of them anywhere in the apartment. I checked the bathroom, the kitchen, the hallway. Nothing. It didn't make any sense. My apartment wasn't big enough for someone to disappear like that. And when I went to check the front door, it was still locked from the inside. Whoever the cloaked figure was, they hadn't left through the door. For days after, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cloaked figure had been more than just an uninvited guest. It felt as though they had been watching, observing us the entire night, silently blending in. To this day, I still wonder if they were ever really there at all, or if they were something else entirely. It was Halloween night in 2018, and my girlfriend and I were walking home from a party a few blocks away from our apartment. The night had been a typical one, costumes, drinks, and laughter filling the air. It was around midnight when we decided to call it a night, saying goodbye to friends and heading down the darkened streets of our neighborhood. Most of the trick-or-treaters had gone home, and the streets were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves and the distant sound of laughter from another Halloween gathering. As we walked, I noticed a black van driving slowly behind us. It was an older model, the kind that always seemed a little out of place in a residential area. I didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was just someone heading home, but the van kept pace with us, moving at the same speed we were walking. After a few blocks, it became clear that the van was deliberately following us. Every time we turned a corner or crossed the street, the van would follow, maintaining a steady, unnerving distance. My initial thought was that it was just someone messing around, but the more it happened, the more my unease grew. I told my girlfriend and we decided to test it. We took a sudden turn down a side street, hoping to lose the van. But no sooner had we made the turn than the van did the same, keeping its distance but staying on our trail. The realization hit hard. We were being followed, and whoever was driving that van wasn't just playing around. We picked up the pace, trying not to let our panic show. The van sped up too, always staying just far enough behind us to not raise immediate alarm but close enough that its presence was undeniable. Finally, we saw a narrow alleyway that cut through to a more populated street. We sprinted for it, our footsteps echoing loudly in the stillness of the night. The van couldn't follow us through the alley, but as we made it to the other side and looked back, I saw the van parked at the entrance of the alley, its headlights off, just sitting there in the darkness. We didn't stop running until we made it back to our apartment. When we finally reached the safety of our building, we looked out the window to see if the van had followed us, but it was gone. There was no trace of it, no sound, no headlights in the distance. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that the van had been waiting for something, an opportunity or a mistake on our part. It wasn't just a random car passing by. It had followed us with purpose, but for what reason, we'll never know. It was as if we had been unknowingly caught in someone's game, and only by running had we managed to escape. It was Halloween 2017, and I was staying at my parents' house for the weekend. They live in a quiet suburban neighborhood where Halloween is always a big deal. The streets are packed with kids in costumes, going door to door collecting candy, and the houses are all decked out with decorations. It's the kind of place where you'd expect a picture-perfect Halloween night. My parents had gone out to a Halloween party, so I was in charge of handing out candy. I didn't mind. It was always fun seeing the kids in their costumes and feeling the energy of the night. By around 10 p.m., the flow of trick-or-treaters had slowed down, and I figured the night was winding down. Just as I was about to turn off the porch light, the doorbell rang. I grabbed the candy bowl and opened the door, expecting to see a group of kids, maybe some teenagers squeezing in a last round of trick-or-treating. But there was just one girl standing there, maybe 8 or 9 years old, dressed in a simple princess costume. She looked a bit pale, her face expressionless, and she was holding out a small, nearly empty bag. I dropped some candy into her bag, smiling and wishing her a happy Halloween, but she didn't say a word. She just stood there for a moment, staring at me, before turning and walking slowly down the driveway. I watched her for a moment, feeling a strange sense of unease. Something about her seemed off. As she reached the end of the driveway, I noticed there were no adults with her. Usually, kids that young had parents or older siblings with them, but she was completely alone. Concerned, I stepped out onto the porch and called out, asking where her parents were. But she didn't respond. She just kept walking down the street, her figure growing smaller in the darkness. Feeling a growing sense of dread, I walked down to the end of the driveway, looking around for any sign of her parents. The street was mostly empty by now, with only a few distant porch lights still on. I couldn't see anyone nearby. I stood there for a few minutes, debating whether I should follow her or call someone, but then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. She hadn't turned down any side streets or gone up to any other houses. She had just vanished into the night. There was no trace of her, no sign that she had ever been there at all. I spent the rest of the night feeling unsettled, replaying the encounter in my mind. The next day, I asked around the neighborhood, wondering if anyone else had seen the girl or if they knew who she was. But no one had seen a girl matching her description, and none of the other neighbors had any kids trick-or-treating alone that night. To this day, I don't know who she was or where she went. It's as if she had appeared out of nowhere, collected her candy, and disappeared just as quickly. The thought that she might have been lost, or worse, that something had happened to her after she left my house, still haunts me. I often wonder if she'll come back next Halloween, knocking on the door with that same empty stare, waiting for her next round of candy before vanishing into the night once more. It was Halloween night in 2019, and my wife and I were spending the evening at home. We had a steady flow of trick-or-treaters throughout the night, but by 9 p.m., the neighborhood had quieted down. We turned off the porch light, figuring the last of the kids had come and gone, and settled in to watch a movie. About halfway through the film, there was a loud knock at the door. It was strange because most of the neighborhood had gone dark, and it was getting late for trick-or-treating. I figured it was just some older kids trying to pull a prank, so I got up to check. When I opened the door, there was no one there. The porch was empty, and the street was silent. I stepped out to take a quick look around, thinking maybe someone had knocked and run off, but the air was still. As I turned to go back inside, I noticed the garage door was wide open. My heart skipped a beat. I distinctly remembered closing it earlier in the evening, and we never left it open at night. I walked over to the garage, and that's when I noticed the door leading from the garage into the house was slightly ajar. My pulse quickened. Something wasn't right. I stepped back into the house, trying to stay calm. I didn't want to alarm my wife, so I told her I was going to check upstairs, just to be sure everything was fine. Grabbing the closest thing to a weapon I could find, a baseball bat, I slowly made my way up the stairs. The house was quiet, but something felt off. As I approached the bedroom, I noticed the window was wide open. We never left the bedroom window open, especially at night. My mind raced with the thought that they could still be in the house. I rushed back downstairs, grabbed my wife, and we left the house immediately. I called the police, and they arrived within minutes. They searched the house, but found no one. The only evidence they found was the broken lock on the bedroom window and a few footprints near the back door. Nothing had been stolen, and the police suggested that whoever had broken in might have been scared off when I came upstairs. But the fact that they had been in the house, watching us, made my skin crawl. The thought that they could have been waiting for the right moment while we sat oblivious on the couch is something I'll never forget. We installed a security system after that night, but the feeling of vulnerability never really went away. Every time I hear a knock at the door late at night or notice a shadow moving outside, my mind flashes back to that Halloween, wondering if someone is out there, watching, waiting.